Hey, everybody, and welcome to Period 3, Part 4, the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. This is going to take us from 1776 to 1789. So, just a quick reminder, as each individual state comes into existence and their new borders are drawn and established, each state sets up its own written plan of government, otherwise known as a constitution. Many of the characteristics of these constitutions were relatively similar, no matter which part of the country you were in. One big noticeable feature was the idea of separation of powers. Usually, the governments were split between 2 to 3 branches of government. Usually, almost always, a legislative branch, one that makes laws, and then a judicial branch, one that judges, or the court system, and the executive branch, the branch that actually executes the laws. Most of the state governments also required property rights for voter eligibility. This wasn't the case in every single state, but it was a pretty common trait in most of the states. The big reason for the property requirement is the argument was that you could only really truly feel like you had a voice in the country if you actually owned a piece of it. Many states also included a Bill of Rights of some sort, something that outlined some basic freedoms that could not be limited in any way by the government. For example, in Virginia, they established the Statute for Religious Freedom, which was famously written by Thomas Jefferson. And if you ever go to his memorial in Washington, D.C., you will see a big chunk of it carved into the side of the memorial. The government was set up based upon republicanism as well. This idea that the power of the government came from the people, usually through some form of representation. What that republicanism was going to look like and what representation was going to look like was ultimately going to be debated in all 13 states. The very first government written by the founders was what is known as the Articles of Confederation, and it was actually established by the Second Continental Congress during the Revolution. In this Articles of Confederation, the government could conduct foreign policy, they could borrow money, they could make treaties. They created a central government with very, very limited power because of their own personal history. The last thing they wanted was to become anything like they were under Britain. And so because of that, they only had a singular Congress, which they felt would keep them more organized. They had no executive branch, therefore nobody who could take total power over everything. They also did not have a federal court system. They felt the states should be allowed to deal with the courts. The central government had no power to tax, which is going to come back to bite them in the butt very soon. And they could not regulate trade. Another big problem, or a few other big problems with the Articles, were that in order to pass any law, you needed more than a majority. You needed 9 out of the 13 states to actually say yes in order to pass a law. All states, no matter how big or how small they were, all had only one vote. While they had different numbers of representatives who could come to their Congress, each one of them still only had one vote. And if they ever wanted to change the Articles of Confederation, all 13 states had to agree to any decision of amending the Articles of Confederation. Again, the central focus of the Articles of Confederation is they did not want to be in any way attached to the type of government that they had been under with England. A few other things the first Congresses established were the Northwest Ordinances. There were 3 of them. All 3 of them are about establishing how do we determine statehood, how do we determine what to do with this big giant Ohio Valley that they've always wanted and finally now own, and how do they figure out how to chunk up that land. So the Land Ordinance of 1784 established the principle that territories could become states as long as their populations reached a certain amount. The one from 1785 set up a way to sell the land to different people and groups. One thing that they had to guarantee, though, was that there would be some sort of public education allowed. And the last one in 1787 established a system so that we could actually create new states. One of our first new states is actually going to be Kentucky. Another thing from the Northwest Ordinance is it banned slavery in the Northwest Territory. So all of this region up here, whatever states came out of it, could ultimately not have slaves. There were a few problems with the Articles of Confederation in action, and the first one was it had a very hard time dealing with foreign policy. In terms of foreign policy problems that the early country came into contact with was first and foremost the British. Yes, it's true, the colonists had won the revolution and the British had lost, but the British did not leave. They had built forts in the West, and they constantly worked at disrupting trade between the new Americans and the Spanish and the French. They also helped to arm the natives so that the indigenous people could continue to protect themselves against the spreading out of the American people. Then there was Spain, who started to ban American shipping along the Mississippi in 1784, therefore keeping America from being able to actually get their goods out through the Mississippi River and into the Gulf of Mexico. France demanded repayment of all of their loans that they had given America during the war. And the Barbary pirates, who were off in the Caribbean, were harassing American shipping and taking over many merchant ships that tried to pass through that region. Another big issue wasn't just foreign issues, there were also many domestic problems that the Articles of Confederation couldn't really deal with. And the most notable event that changed everything was Shays' Rebellion. So after the American Revolution, the U.S. economy was in a very, very deep depression. Not like everyone was sad, but it was an economic depression. The group that was hit the hardest were small, average, everyday farmers. And they were hit the hardest because they oftentimes were asked to pay taxes for things for other states that they didn't live in. Daniel Shay led what will now be known as Shays' Rebellion. He was a veteran of the Revolution and a farmer in Massachusetts, and he led a rebellion of poor farmers to the State House. Their goal was to take over the arsenal of weapons and then take over the government. Their demands were lower taxes. They wanted there to be an end to the foreclosures on their farms. They wanted paper money so that it was easier to access for all people. And they wanted the end of the normal treatment that if you were in debt, you were put in jail. Ultimately, the rebellion did work in a way. Shays' Rebellion was eventually taken down, and many of the men were either killed or arrested. But one thing it did show, as you can see, it lasted from 1786 to 1787, was that the federal government was ultimately too weak to put down even this small rebellion of poor farmers. And because of that, there was a call for a much stronger central government. Because of this call for it, the representatives of the 13 colonies come back together in Annapolis to begin discussing trade and commerce. At this particular convention, they start to realize that many of the different states are having problems with different types of rebellions similar to Shays, and ultimately realize that maybe, just maybe, the government they created in the Articles of Confederation wasn't quite strong enough to control such a massive country. So they decided to meet in Philadelphia 1 year later at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where they decided to revise the Articles of Confederation. 55 delegates were sent there for the sole and express purpose of just revising the Articles of Confederation. When they got there and started talking, they realized revision was not the issue. The issue was they needed to just totally start over and create a much stronger central government. It did not happen easily. It took a lot of compromises, and it took a lot of debate about what should be done in this new constitution. The biggest issue at the convention was the concept of representation. It was one of the biggest problems with the Articles of Confederation. The articles said that every single state, no matter how big or how small, had the same exact number of representatives. Representation is what gave a state power in Congress. The problem was that big states, like Virginia, felt like they should have more power than a little state like New Jersey. Boop. James Madison introduced the Virginia Plan, otherwise known as the Large State Plan, and he said that there should be 2 houses, and representation should be based on population. The larger your population, the more representation you got. The New Jersey Plan was then also passed or looked at, and this was called the Small State Plan. And the idea was that we should only have one house in Congress and that representation should be equal, no matter how big or small. Roger Sherman, clearly a brainiac, introduced what's known as the Great Compromise, or the Sherman Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise. And what it said was, we will have a bicameral legislature, otherwise known as two houses, an upper house being the U.S. Senate, where every single state, no matter how big or how small they are, will get two representatives. And there will be a lower house, the House of Representatives, and this representation will be based on population. It worked, and that's what we have today. Other issues that the founders had to deal with was the issue of slavery. It was something that could not be denied. The debate over whether slaves should be counted in the state population was an issue, as was the conversation of should slavery continue to exist in the United States of America. In terms of representation, the colonists or the Americans ultimately came to the decision and the compromise known as the 3/5 Compromise, where slaves would be counted, but they would only be counted as 3/5 of a person when deciding representation in the House of Representatives. Again, this was a compromise as a way to try and appease the plantation owners of the South and keep them at the table in terms of conversing about all of the other parts of the Constitution. Another thing that was also compromised on was that the slave trade would be allowed to continue, but it did have an end date, and it was supposed to end in 1808. When we're talking about the slave trade, we're talking about the international slave trade, the actual importation of human beings across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to what is now the United States. It was allowed to continue until 1808, and that was written in the Constitution. Another thing that was written in the Constitution was the creation of what's called the Fugitive Slave Act, that if any person who was enslaved ran away, it was required by law to return them to the person who owned them. Although the word slave or slavery was not used in the Constitution explicitly, the institution of slavery was very much so protected by the original document. The founders were very aware of the fact that if they used the word, they could never get rid of it in the future. So because of that, they didn't actually use the word slave or slavery in the Constitution, but they very much so protected it, whether it was because they continued the slave trade, 3/5 Compromise, or the Fugitive Slave Act. Once the Constitution was established, there was a huge and massive debate over ratifying it, meaning putting it into practice and getting it signed. There were two groups that argued either for or against it. On the side of getting the Constitution ratified immediately were the Federalists. They supported the Constitution and they believed in a strong federal or central government. On the other side were the Anti-Federalists. These were people who were critics of the Constitution and ultimately favored a more weak or central government. They predominantly favored states' rights. The Federalists, as a way to try and convince Americans to support them, ultimately sat down and wrote a collection of documents known as the Federalist Papers. They're 85 different essays that lay out the reasons why the Americans should support the ratification of the Constitution. They were written famously by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. One big way that the Federalists were ultimately finally able to get a guarantee that the Constitution would be ratified was appeasing something the Anti-Federalists wanted, which was a Bill of Rights. The Anti-Federalists were very fearful of too strong of a central government, and so because of that, they wanted the rights of the people to be written down. Enumerated individual rights and explicitly restricted powers of the federal government. Enumerated, again, meaning just listed. In 1789, George Washington took the office as the nation's first president and followed along with the rules that were established in the Constitution in Article 2 for the executive branch. Other random stuff you should know about the Constitution. It set up a government based on popular sovereignty, meaning power is in the hands of the people. It established a separation of powers, so we have three branches of government: the legislative, Congress, the judicial, the Supreme Court, and the rest of the courts, and the executive, the presidency. The Constitution set up a division of power between national and state governments, otherwise known as federalism, the balance of power between state governments and the national government. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, so anything that is added to it becomes law for every single state. and presidents would not be directly elected by the voters. The founders did not trust the average American citizen, and because of that, they wanted to limit the excessive power of popular influence. They feared that too much democracy would lead to mob rule and would lead to different groups of people yelling and screaming in the streets and not focused on just getting the job done, which was making sure that the country ran. So they established the Electoral College as a way to try and dampen the power of direct democracy.